Assalamualaikum and good morning. I'm Muhammad Shahidi, our moderator for today, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the National Competitiveness Webinar, a webinar series brought to you by Malaysia Productivity Corporation, or MPC. First and foremost, I would like to thank MPC for organizing today's webinar, to our speaker, Mr. Eddie, and to the viewers for spending your morning to learn and to know more about behavioral insight. Today is the third and last series of Behavioral Insight Framework webinar, where Mr. Eddie will share with us a bit more on behavioral insight and prime framework. To recap, we have been through this prime framework, yeah, PRI, where P stands for purpose, research, and intervention. And today we will learn more about M and E, that stands for measure and expand. I welcome everyone to participate, to ask questions, to give opinion, maybe share your thoughts. You can write down the question in the chat area or in the Q&A column. I will try my best to relay the question or opinion to our speakers. And please do stay until the end, as there will be an evaluation form, and you will need to answer the form to get your certificate if you need. So before we start, I would like to briefly introduce about our speaker. Mr. Eddie Razak is a senior advisor at Eden Strategy Institute, Singapore. Eden is an institution providing advisory and professional consultancy services internationally for government and corporation, especially on policy and innovation. Formerly, Mr. Eddie Innovation Agency under the Malaysian government. Prior to that, Mr. Eddie was a prominent figure in the corporate world, and he did voluntary work in education and social services. To be honest, Mr. Eddie's CV is very comprehensive and very long indeed. So you guys can check our previous videos to learn more about him. But for today, we would like to welcome Mr. Eddie to start with today's presentation. So floor is yours, Mr. Eddie. Silakan. You are still on mute, Mr. Eddie.
So very sorry for that. Thank you, Shahidi. Can you hear me now, everyone?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, MPC, for inviting me for this webinar. As mentioned by Shahidi, this is the third of a series of 3 webinars. The first webinar, we talked about principles and theories behind behavioral insights. And then second one, we talked about how you design those interventions. And today we talk about how you deliver, implement, measure, etc. You know? So for those of you who are new to behavioral insights, and many things you can learn about behavioral insights, about nudges and all that. But the framework that we're doing is really about how do you apply those interventions? How do you apply behavioral insights? So it's more an application kind of webinar today. And particularly, we're looking at how you apply it in the public policy or in the corporate policy sector. So today we're going to cover, of course, touch on the prime framework, the process of prime, and then zoom in into measuring results and expanding. Earlier we talked about PRI, now we talk about NE. And then we contextualize that with policy making by looking at it in how you compare that with logical framework matrix. And then lastly, we'll close with a bit of discussion on ethical considerations on applying BI. So I'll dive right into it, a lot to cover now. And at the end, I'll invite you to ask questions, or if you have questions along the way, feel free to also put them in the chat box here. So we'll answer those questions. Okay, so now this slide I've shared before. Here you can see there's purpose, research, and intervention. Today we cover measure and expand. Yeah? So now I'm just going to go straight into an example, because then maybe you get a clearer sense. Okay, so this is an example of, let's say, flu vaccination. How to raise the flu vaccination uptake. In this case, it's among government employees in New Zealand. They did this behavioral insights intervention. So what is the purpose that they want to do this? Of course, they want to have healthier government employees and also less downtime, because downtime always costs money, right? And then after that, you do a bit of research into the background. What is the statistics around sickness during flu season? And then why are people apathetic or reluctant to go into preventive healthcare? And then also, when you want people to get vaccinated, really there is a process behind it. You don't just turn up, you have to register, and then there's some disclosure forms that you have to agree to, and then schedule it, and maybe there are more than one dose, and you have to schedule and actually turn up for those programs. And in this case, they did some interventions through some personal touch, and they focus on how they make the process very straightforward and very welcoming, right, where it touches on people's or encourage people's behavior. And finally, there are various measurements like number of employees who've been vaccinated, what's the decrease in MC that people. So don't worry too much about how this intervention was done. You can go through it. There are many sites, but what I want to focus on is on the left side. You see the process there. You look at the purpose. You do a bit of research. You get into the intervention, and then you measure. So this is where, when you try to introduce a behavioral insight intervention, think of it this way. Let's jump into a second example. In this case, job matching. Of course, many countries do job matching. In this case, it's in Canada, because in the West, they have applied behavioral insights quite early on. So first, of course, why do you want to get people into jobs? Of course, you want to reduce unemployment, right? But you also want to reduce the subsidies, right? Welfare subsidies, Here, Jabatan Kebajikan Masyarakat, they found that, a lot of people who receive this welfare actually don't want to get jobs, even though they can get jobs, So, so when you do a bit of research, you have to look at what is the behavioral desire for people to want to apply for a job. And then you look at how do you convert that into action? And when and where do they participate on either physical job fairs, but nowadays everything will be online, so job portals. And then the actual process of matching the skills and experience to the job is not as straightforward as, whether you qualify. You really should match a bit of skills. And then the compatibility between employers, jobs, and employees. Then they did a bunch of interventions, like framing those decisions in a positive way, using powers of social norm, and also using commitment devices, which have a call to action and step-by-step process. You actually have to. You don't just post it and then expect people to turn up. You actually have to intervene and make them turn up. And then you measure, what is the click-through rate, or what is a percentage of submissions. Again, don't focus on what exactly they did. You can go through that later, but look at the process that they went through: purpose, research, interventions, measure. Right. Now, since we're focusing on measure at the moment, so let's just have a quick look at what kind of measuring tools there are. There's like randomized control trials, which is where you have one group, which is the control group, that you don't do anything to this control group, and you see what is the outcomes of that. And then you have, let's say, group B, and in this group B, you'd have this kind of intervention. You see what is the outcome, and then maybe you have a group C as well. Then you see what's the outcome. Maybe you have another group D. So for B, C, D, maybe you have different approaches. You have different treatments. And they have different results. So this is where this is in a nutshell what is randomized controlled trials is. To know more, of course, the academics are very much experts in this area. They can help you. If in your organization you want to do RTC, you can get some academics to help you. Another kind of testing is A/B testing. This one works very well, especially with digital kind of approaches, digital interventions. So for instance, you have variation A, where you send a particular kind of email with this kind of wording, and you see what is the response. Another group, you send another kind of email that has maybe a more serious tone, and see what is the response. maybe a third variation C where you send another kind of email. You see, so quite often they use this, and in America they use this A/B testing, for instance, to get people to vote. In Malaysia, our voting rate is very high, but in America, most people, they don't bother to vote. To get them to vote, right, you have to motivate them. So they send those emails, and how the emails are worded actually influence them to actually go out and vote, whether it's important to vote. They actually go out, and you get the votes that way. So actually, just as a side note, Obama had a very good outcome because he focused on digital interventions. So, so that's a bit about measurement. Not too much detail about how you actually apply it. But now let's look at, you might think to yourself, okay, that's quite straightforward. Okay, I look at the purpose and, do a bit research, do intervention, measure. Oh, I know all that. I always do that. But let's say we want to contextualize this in policy making. So here we look at this inverted funnel. Of course, there are many things that go into it. I just simplify this in a simple diagram to help you understand. So at the top level, what are policymakers most interested in? What are they looking at? They look at the big policy, broad policy aspirations. What are the broad policy areas that they need to look at? So for instance, is it healthcare? Is it jobs? Is it economic productivity, things like that? And then from these large policy areas, then you zoom down into specific policy goals. And here is where then it is handed down to implementing agencies, right? Like NPC is an implementing agency for this, right? It is not just a government implementing agencies. It can also be NGOs getting involved in the action. It can be experts, it can be universities getting involved, it can be even the private sector getting involved. And then you look at what is the target demographic that you want to intervene upon. So hence, you don't just, once you have that, you don't just leave it as that. You need to then define what are the measurable outcomes that you want out of this. And here, if you look on the right, I sort of outline the kinds of outcomes that are related to behavioral change or behavioral interventions that you want, which is, of course, how you change behavior, whether there's a good compliance, what is the rate of compliance, what's the rate of adoption to a certain regulation or policies, and whether it's cost effective, and whether on the long term, whether there is good societal impact. So when you introduce a regulation or a procedure or a law or something, let's say standard operating procedure, you also want people to behave. You want them to change their behavior towards that SOP, for instance, or you want to see that there is a high compliance rate to that SOP, for instance, right? And that SOP doesn't become very expensive to apply, to actually enforce and, to punish people, issue fines and all that. Actually, you would like to avoid all that. And finally, you want to see whether there is an overall impact on societal good behavior in society. Yeah? So now let's just contextualize this in the way that we look at the logical framework matrix. For some of you who are familiar with this kind of thinking, governments, a lot of governments use this logical framework matrix to define policies that they have created. So some of you in government may be quite familiar with this, where it looks at the inputs, which are things like resources that go into it. It can be budget, it can be manpower, it can be which organizations are involved, how much, what length of time you're going to focus on this. Those are the kinds of inputs. I just simplify, yeah? And then you look at the outputs to those inputs. The outputs are things like how many programs you run for that policy. At what locations do you run those programs? How many people attend those programs? And at what levels? What are the follow-up kinds of programs that you have? And then finally, you look at the outcomes. Outcomes meaning that, is there like let's say, what are the statistical scores to those programs. Maybe you do have some basic statistical scores to it. How many people pass, how many fail, how many certificates you issued, right? And how many follow-up programs. So you have this input that leads to output and that leads to outcome. Notice one thing, I haven't talked about impact. Impact, of course, is a very long-term thing. It deals with the counterfactual. Counterfactual meaning things that would not have occurred or has not occurred, but because of your intervention has occurred and changed the trajectory of something. That's impact. But anyway, this LFM tends to look at more input, output, and outcome, because the impact is a deeper level of analysis you need to do. So now, what I'm saying here is that this prime process, we can just overlay it. We're not saying that the LFM is not working. We say let's overlay it on top of it and look at how it. Then there is an interactive process in terms of research and intervention, in terms of measuring. There's a back and forth process, especially when you deal with behaviors. Let me give you an example. Let's say now MPC is doing a particular project with the Ministry of Education to look at the acceptance or response to TVET, Technical and Vocational Education and Training, and look at TVET. So the problem is that although TVET is seen as a policy area that we want to expand because it's good for the economy, but parents and school leavers, quite often they feel that TVET is something that's not attractive, so they don't want to get into it. They feel that, if you can't get into other jobs, then only you go into TVET. Or the perception is that TVET is like the vocational school last time. You do woodworking lah, you do bengkel repair lah. That's a negative perception. Whereas in other countries like Germany, for instance, and Japan, they build the economy based on vocational skills among their population, and these are advanced skills. That's why the Germans can build the best cars, right? And the Japanese can build the most efficient and low-cost cars, right? So that's why TVET is important. But now, how do you change that behavior where people then, let's say you set up a TVET school, in addition to normal school, you set up. So what are the inputs required? You have to, of course, build the school. You have to put in resources like teachers. You have to build the program behind it. You have to have an ongoing development budget as well as an operating budget for that. So those are the inputs. And then you have the school, you run the program and all that, and then you expect a certain outcome. But however, the outcome is not the same as what you expect, and it's not commensurate with the amount of input that you put in. It is not commensurate because people's behavior have got this mental block. So what we're showing is that look at it as an overlay. Let's apply behavioral insights on top of that, where then we iterate the process of looking at where the gaps are. For example, the example of TVET, for instance, how do you then encourage people to want to get into TVET, for instance, right? And then you measure those behavioral outcomes and then you adjust it accordingly.
Mr. Eddie, previously, when we talk about logical framework metrics, do they consider behavior as one of the criteria to be looked into? Or are they just thinking of the outcome based on the result itself without considering behavior?
Well, I think in general, it has not taken into account behavioral insights in the past because this is a relatively new area. There's not much clear understanding what are the human behaviors that affect their choices. So it has not been taken into account so much. So now we should take this into account when we implement those programs, policies. We should take into account people's behaviors.
Do they know that people are irrational? People, things like you've mentioned heuristic. Is that something that they even consider, or they are looking at it in perspective where people are very rational, especially when it comes to logical framework metrics. I'm sure you've been through the process last time. And can you explain a bit how did you guys make decision last time?
Yeah, I think in the past the perception is that when people are not behaving as how you expect them to, you think it's because they don't have knowledge. Yeah. So you then have to educate. You build more awareness. So the problem with awareness program is sort of like a push program. It's a top-down program. I tell you, right? But I don't understand what you think, you know. And then when they don't respond accordingly, you think that they have a very negative mindset. They are not very productive because.
Malaysian malas. Yeah.
But then it is not entirely that. It is actually there are some common traits of heuristics, how people actually think. This is very interesting because people think in a certain way, and they always think like that. Anywhere in the world, they always think like that. It's the same. So when you have this bias, people have a similar bias anywhere in the world. So it's not that our people are not knowledgeable, or our people are no motivation. Yeah, maybe, but then it's not just that. They have biases, and these biases is the same anywhere.
Interesting.
Right. So I go on, yeah. So yeah, you touch on a bit about the difference between traditional policy making. So you look on the left, there's a simplified chart. I'm not saying that this is the whole thing, but I'm just simplifying it as how it looks at policy goals, and then you implement those policy action and program, and then you roll it out. This is just a simplified, okay? So, but then where a behavioral insight approach is that you look into a bit of research around it. But what kind of research? You research around behaviors. Yeah. And then you look at a citizen-centric emphasis or approach to it. What are the pain points? What are the value systems to people? Understand that and then adapt to it. And then look at the body of evidence, not just within your own country, in other places, in other locations. You can look at that. What kind of intervention tend to work, right? And then use this, also collect your own evidence as well and build a database around it that maybe other ministries can also use, other agencies can also use. It's quite transferable, actually. So I mentioned behaviors. So, I didn't go into these actual behaviors. That was a different session. Here we're talking about the process or the framework for implementing. But let's just quickly look at what are the behavioral insight theories and tools and biases and all that. There are so many. This is not the whole thing, and there are more. Actually. So for instance, let's pick up one. Confirmation bias. This is where you already have a sense in your head, and then you always look for information that support whatever you believe. So you go to Facebook, you say, yeah, I said this one, so I confirm this is what is true. Facebook said that. Okay, but you did not look at the part of Facebook where people say something else. You always look at the thing. So this is like people say echo chamber. You just listen to the people that you are within your echo chamber. And the more you are within your echo chamber, the more you are convinced that it's true. I think that's also what happened in America, right? The people who are, protesting and all that, they're in the echo chamber, they believe it so much, So, okay, what's interesting is the confirmation bias in America is the same as the confirmation bias in Malaysia. It's the same behavior. Of course, we confirm different things. Maybe they confirm that they believe in Trump. We confirm something else. But the behavior is the same. So you see, it is actually the same behavior. So humans are normally like that. Let's pick up another one, loss aversion. I think you may have noticed people hate losing more than they love winning. So they hate loss so much more than they enjoy the gain. I'll give you an example. If let's say from zero, then suddenly I give you 100 ringgit, right? Of course you are happy, right? But let's say if from zero you lost 100 ringgit, I think you will remember that for a long time. Or let's say I give you 100 ringgit And then after that, that same 100 ringgit you lost. Or maybe I take it back from you and I steal it back from you. Which one you remember? You remember I give you, or you remember you lost? I, I think most likely you remember the loss,
The
right?
lost
I'll
one.
give you
Yeah.
another example. Let's say you start with zero. Now I give you 200 ringgit. And then after that, I take back 100. I say, hey, actually, I need 100. I cannot give you 200. I need. So give me back 100 lah. So now how much you have? You have 100, right? So you think you will be happy or not?
You'll be
Actually,
thinking
you
about the
will be
100
happy
again.
because you had nothing. I give you 100,
Yep.
but you're not happy.
Yeah.
Why? Because before your anchor is zero.
Yeah.
And then after that, your anchor become 200.
Yeah.
And then because your anchor is 200, now you get 100. Oh, you lost. You forget your anchor was zero. You think your anchor is now 200. This is loss aversion. And it's the same anywhere in the world. You go to anywhere, you go to Korea, you go to Middle East. Now people have the same behavior everywhere. So don't you think that when you have a policy, don't you think that you should understand that behavior and mitigate that instead of just coming up with a policy and assume that people will just, hey, I give you 100, I should be happy, what? Well, I make a policy. I say that you can do this, and suddenly I backtrack. You cannot do this. Okay, why? You still can go out. So it is not the case. Sometimes people have anchor. So out of all these behavioral insight theories and tools, right, there are many. I won't go into all of it. I've just given you two example. But the thing I want to stress is that they are the same everywhere. So it is not that we are special or we are like this or our people are not knowledgeable or people are just not motivated. It's not that. We all have the same behavior. It's just that different scale of it, different condition, but it is the same. But what does that mean? That means that these behaviors are interchangeable, commutable. That means that if I have studied in Canada, I've studied a behavioral intervention in Canada or in New Zealand, actually I can use the same behavior intervention in Malaysia, because the people respond the same way. Right? Of course, slightly different, but it's the same. So this is where what some people say, humans are irrational, but they are predictably irrational. You can predict how they are irrational. So
That's
here,
that's a that's a question because it's regarding the same point that we are talking about right now. From Anna Grace Ranoko, the question is
from
actually Anna Grace Ranoko. I'm not really sure from right,
interesting.
but her question is: since the participants here are from different countries, do we need to look on culture in relation to behavior in making policy? I think you've been answering the question, but she realized, I think she realized this before you mentioned your
Yes.
points. And then there's another question from Mr. Asohan Satkuna Singham. He said that recently Malaysia fell 6 steps in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. If we use the prime framework, as we have already extensive policies, regulation, and even a national anti-corruption plan, what else Malaysia needs to do within this framework so that we could be the first 10 countries like Singapore and other Scandinavian countries. It's interesting because you mentioned that everyone, even in Singapore and in all these Scandinavian countries, have the same heuristic behavior. So please
Okay,
do comment.
that's a very interesting question, Asohan. Thank you. So let's say if you apply the framework. So first of all, you look at what is your big policy goal, right? Is your policy goal that you want to then reduce this level of corruption? I'm not going to get into complicated institutional or high level corruption. Those are very hard to manage. But let's say we start with the low level corruption, right? So first you look at the policy goals, right? Then you can actually apply behavioral insights interventions at the lower level to people. so that maybe at the among young people in terms of education, you can see one on the screen now. There is something called sense of fairness. People choose differently if they feel they benefit unfairly or if unfair to others. So, for instance, if I give you 100 ringgit, like in that case, right? But I don't give your friend, actually you should not care, right? He is somebody else. But actually people care because they feel it's unfair. I got the 100, he didn't get the 100. So I don't want the 100. There is a normal behavior, no matter which culture. Of course, to different degrees, it's normal. You look at another one there, social norm. What is the social norm? When many people people care about what other people think, people like them, what they think. So, for instance, if let's say I'm a smoker, let's say, which I'm not. Let's say people around me who get the second-hand smoke, they don't care. I also don't care. But if the people around me care, then I will be a bit embarrassed. That is normal. Better still, if my family members care, I will care even more. So you don't target the smokers, you target the family members. In fact, that happens to be an NPC project to look at that. So when it comes to let's say corruption as well, you can also look at these social norms, and also the example of I think in my latest slides where I talked about the diffuse responsibility. When there are many people involved, the responsibility to that person is diffuse. So people are not afraid. So let's say something negative like corruption. Sometimes it occurs during, within a realm of the responsibility is so many people. So, people feel it's okay because nobody can notice what I do. So that's where you then have to look at that, change that focus from diffuse to where you can actually identify. Okay. Shall I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay. That's okay. So just now that slide you saw, I showed a lot of theories and tools of behavioral insights, and then I did mention something very important, that it is actually similar anywhere, everywhere. It is similar, not the same, but similar. So hence, this body of knowledge can be a database of evidence where we take lessons that we learn around the world, we can apply it to policy making in Malaysia, for instance, right? Not just among government, but also NGOs, for instance. If let's say you're an NGO and you want to drive this people against corruption, for instance, you can actually look at some of these interventions, like I mentioned, some of the things that work. You can apply it to these examples. And let's say you have applied and then it looks successful, other people can learn from you as well. So that's a database of evidence. And then also think of it as a diagnostic kit. You now have a diagnostic kit that you know how to solve problems. Right? So, for instance, if I am able to solve, not solve, but I'm able to reduce the percentage of people who smoke, for instance, right? I can use the similar intervention for reducing diabetes, for instance. People who like to drink teh tarik, for instance, right? And unnecessarily, right? So maybe it is a diagnostic kit that you apply to other kinds of interventions. And finally, look at it in terms of a very good policy tool. Whatever policy tools you have, if you remember the previous sessions, I talked about the traditional policy tools. What are they? Pricing, incentives, information. In the past, we use pricing. Pricing is like, what is the rate, what is the tariff, and then incentives or disincentive like subsidies, grants, or we impose tax or we give tax allowance, right? Or we have information. Information is like awareness, publicity, social media, and all that. Those are traditional policy tools. But we have overlooked the policy tool of behavioral insights. So it is an additional tool. I'm not saying you don't use that, But when you want to come up with a good regulation, or you have a good regulation already, but you will need to enhance it, or you have a SOP, you know. Now everybody understands SOP, right? You have SOP, you want to enhance it, apply a bit of behavioral insights. I mentioned last time that now during the pandemic, right? At the moment, there is no vaccine, so you can have regulations, you can have MCO and all that, but very important, most important actually is behavioral change. What are they? Wearing masks, washing hands, social distancing. Can you see how the regulations don't work without the change in behavior? That's, I mentioned last time, that's what happened in America, for instance. The people don't want to change behavior because they're quite fixated on this thing about freedom and all that. They say they have a right not to wear masks because it infringes on their right to breathe and all that and all kinds of things, right? But even if you regulations, you can't force people. So behavior is so anyway. This is a snapshot where you look at it as a database of evidence, a diagnostic kit, as well as a policy tool. I've come to the last few slides, and then later I'm going to open to question. Now, how is this useful? You can apply BI in designing policies and getting these policies to be adopted uh, for government as well as the private sector. For instance, for government, you want to then understand and then shape the policies that that result in the success of the failure, or study the success or failure of these policies and regulation and tweak it accordingly. And also for corporations, also you want to also design responses to your policies and regulations. For instance, big organizations, you have they're very concerned about how they motivate the employees, right? So you actually can implement behavioral insights there. In infrastructure design, for instance, can help planners, say government authorities, to understand the usage or the underuse of public facilities and infrastructure. Why people underuse some public facilities? Like say you set up a badminton court in your local council there. They want Serbaguna. There's a badminton court, but people don't use the badminton court. Why is that? There is underlying reason why people are not motivated. They behave, accordingly. Or even for developers, property developers, or people who develop leisure complex, they want to improve the infrastructure according to the behavior. So, for instance, stadiums, for instance, you might find that you have not designed it in a certain way, or you have designed it in a perfect way, and yet people don't behave. Which reminds me of how the Japanese, after the FIFA World Cup, they stay back and they clean up the stadium, right? So that is, imagine an example of good behavior. But what is that motivates them? Okay. Then next, public services, how you enhance effectiveness of services, right? First, to understand and adapt. And also for corporations, also they want businesses wants to then improve services in accordance with consumer behavior. Just imagine, a company like Facebook. I think their algorithms, they understand behavior so well. They understand. They have embedded behavioral insights into all their algorithms so well that people say they know you better than you know yourself. And lastly, organizational change. Enhance the effectiveness and performance within the ministry, within the government, within the agencies, right? And also for corporations that achieve more productive, better competitiveness. And this is what MPC wants. Corporations, then they improve their internal capabilities, taking into account, especially those who are front-facing, right? How they perform better and they are productive and competitive. Okay, that's a lot. Any questions so far before I go? This is my last slide.
So far, there's no. Okay, suddenly there's a question from Mr. Wong, TW Wong. Comparing the expand step in prime to step 7 and 8 of Kotter's 8-step change model. How does the BI approach build on the change resulting from the BI intervention to make it stick for the long term and anchored in culture? Did you get the question, Mr. Eddie?
This is based on what body of knowledge? Quarters.
Quarters 8 step.
Okay. So which step are we talking about?
Because I'm guessing, because his question is, how does the BI approach build on the change resulting from the BI intervention? It's about, after we get the answer, and how do we make it stick? How do we ensure that it will run smoothly even after the intervention? And can we anchor it in culture?
I think in general, it's a bit hard to answer your question because I can't remember the steps and all that and where you are at. Maybe we can take it offline. You feel free to send an email. We can discuss this further. But in general, yes, you can, because that process has a way to look at culture and all that. I think it's like maybe they look at upstream, how it leads to downstream and all that. I think generally the answer is yes, you can. But how you do it, I think we can take it separately in more depth. Yeah? Okay, shall I go on now? My last slide here is I'm going to talk a bit about the ethics considerations. Yeah. So now, when you implement behavioral insights, you need to, or you should understand that it is really an intentional effort that you need to drive, or you want to drive behavior in a certain direction. You want to nudge people in a certain direction. But it is important that when you do it, it's not for bad reasons, it's for good reasons. So there was an example where in some in Nazi Germany, for instance, this actually happened, in the voting paper, right? The thing that you vote for the Nazi party is the circle is very big, and the other party is very small. So they're sending you a message, like, okay, you know what to do, right? That actually happened, I mean, it's so funny that, they do that. But this is where they did not look at the ethics behind it. For instance, you don't look at, the people's choice, So, and whether, sometimes when you collect information on them, or you try to intervene on their behavior, you're not forcing them. That example where, there's organ donation, right? It's a very good example of organ donation. You're not forcing them to donate the organ. Different people have different cultural beliefs or religious beliefs. Some people want, some people don't want. You don't force them. So they have to give their own consent. They have a choice. Then you respect their privacy or their rights. I mentioned just now, people also think that not wearing a mask is actually their right. So they forget that other people who are subject to the giving them the virus, they also have their rights. Sense of fairness and responsibility. These are all very important considerations, right? So it is not something that you command and control. You use nudges to command and control people, and nudge in different direction. That is a negative thing. So that's why in behavioral insight they call it libertarian paternalism. Paternalism is like a father, right, or mother, right, maternal, paternal, right. But libertarian is like, I don't force you, I guide you. So like parents, good parents, actually they do that, right? They only focus on. I think mothers and fathers sometimes they're very good in behavior insights for their children. They already understand. I cannot force. I have to motivate them in a different way. So I've shown here that sometimes you, of course, you have integrity in allowing people to have their choice, and then that when you have over strict control, it actually demotivates people, and then you have to actually build more trust, and then quite often people they they're not always ethical all the time. Sometimes they make mistakes. You should understand. And I mentioned also just now, remember diffuse responsibility. So let's say you know all that, but sometimes you still need to implement this behavioral insight in your policy making. So as a guide, you as a policy maker, If you believe, or you have just you have looked at the big picture, and you feel that there is strong justification where you must introduce these behavior interventions because it's for the public good, okay, that this is a thing that you should consider, where the block that says strong justification, or you see that there is a very clear societal impact to what you're doing, or if you see it is of institutional importance. So for institutional importance, for instance, general health care, general medical care, it is very, uh, uh, you don't want to overload your hospitals. It's an institutional importance. So you bring about these interventions. Okay. And that about wraps up the presentation for today. I open it up to questions.
For the time being, there's no question from our viewers, but I'm very much interested in our bias in loss aversion just now, in confirmation bias. It is something that we've seen the whole time. Memang it's something that is very familiar to us. Yet it's not something that we think of that much. As for example, confirmation bias. We know that that is something that is very prevalent, very clear. For example, if you are a supporter of Liverpool, for example, so you have your confirmation bias in the sense that everything happened is against you, that you are always right, your team is the best, your player is the best, but we don't really, try to look in a bigger picture. We always focus on that kind of area, sports and politics, when it comes to confirmation bias. But I think confirmation bias is something that can be applied in almost every areas. We have our own set of belief, and I guess it's about understanding. And when it comes to behavioral insight, I realize that it's not really magic kind of solution, but it's about testing. So do you have any opinion on that, Mr. Eddie?
Yeah. So the this thing about confirmation bias, it can become a very dangerous situation, especially because nowadays it's too easy to receive information according to your preference because of social media, you know.
Mm,
So maybe in the old days your confirmation bias comes from newspaper articles.
mm,
So and then you can buy article that is like right wing, or you can buy newspaper that is left wing, but there are limited numbers of papers, right? But nowadays there are so many, and so what happens is that people go deeper and deeper into their mental silo, and they go deeper and deeper into their echo chamber because all they read is about the same thing that confirms whatever they already believe. Right? And so the algorithm also don't give them other things outside there, whatever they're interested. It just gives them what they just wants to hear. They know that these people. So you go deeper and deeper, and you are more and more convinced. And the more and more convinced you are, you don't look beyond into other schools of thought. You just look within there, and it becomes quite dangerous, and people become polarized. So much so, let's say in I just like to give an example in America, because nobody can blame me from America lah. I don't think they
yeah.
would that. But in America, the confirmation bias, the Republicans are so against the Democrats, and the Democrats also don't understand the Republicans, and really polarized there, and so much so that people are. It's not a cohesive country, So amazing.
Yeah. You brought up social media, especially Facebook understands us more than, I guess, our friend pun kan. And last time there's an issue with Cambridge Analytica where they took Facebook's data, where Facebook provide them with the data. And if I'm not mistaken, they have like 5,000 data point on a person. Even I myself don't really know 5,000 things about my kids, for example. So it shows that how 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 they properly use it, how they have all the data, and how they are utilizing behavioral data for their own advantage. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So companies like Facebook and Google, for instance, at the end of the day, they just want to sell advertisement. So they use that to profile you, and then they send the advertisements that you will likely buy those things.
Yeah.
So that's what they do. But those advertisers, they're also smart lah. Okay, then I want to leverage on this because I don't want to waste my time if the person is, let's say, the person is a mother. Maybe they buy baby products, right? So they want to don't waste time on the fathers, for instance, right? They won't buy, right? Just a general example. So, but that is good. In a way, it's good because you happen to be looking for that, so it's good. You didn't waste time. Straight away, you found the item, right? But it is misused. So you've heard that in countries like they say that the Russians are interfering with the U.S. elections, right, through Facebook and all that. Yeah, because the tool is there for you to influence. That's why ethics is also very important. You don't misuse this.
There's a question from Nico Dan Miro. Hi, sir. How likely is it for a company to further achieve progress if it's implementing the open door policy? I guess is open door policy is one of the way to further achieve progress.
For a company,
How likely is it for a company to further achieve progress? Is it by implementing the open door policy?
okay. Well, are we talking about
Quite general. The question is quite.
organizational performance management? Let's say the bosses have an open door policy. Are we talking about that? Or we're talking about in general transparency within the organization?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it all depends on the kind of organization that you have. If your organization is a millennial type organization, right? I think it's better to have the open door policy. But if your organization is more like a SME that is a production, right? Sometimes it doesn't work so well, right? Uh,
So when it comes to BI, I guess the most important thing is about testing. It's about understanding. It's not one way or apa, my way or the highway. It's not that kind of solution, I guess, because sometimes we think that we know the answers, but the best way is for us to test. And from your prime framework, we can see it's a process of not just giving the answer, but it's about understanding the purpose, doing the research, and then do the intervention, and etc. Uh, is it true? What is your opinion on that?
Exactly, of course. Yeah. So, first of all, I think policymakers or, people in organization uh, have a basic understanding of people's behaviors and all that.
Mm.
Uh, and these are common behaviors, and you understand. Uh, People now understand very much the language people understand already in America, for instance. Of course, the people who came up with behavioral insights, they won a Nobel Prize, right? Because it's a branch of economics. And the people, there's another four more people who have done behavioral insight research, also won the Nobel Prize. So roughly, if I'm not mistaken, roughly about six people have won the Nobel Prize relating to behavior. So it's good to understand that, and then you shape your policies because this is going to be something that's mainstream. When people talk about confirmation bias, you know what it means.
Mm.
People talk about loss aversion, and when you implement something, you already enter. Oh, this is going to be a loss aversion problem. Before I do it, it's going to be loss aversion problem, right?
I realize people have this perception that BI, suddenly you can just answer. In this case, if there's any issues, you can just answer it based on your BI knowledge. But I think it's important for the viewers to understand that BI requires testing. The process prime is the process of getting the information, of delivering the right kind of policy. It's not one answer to fix all. It's not one way to fix all. But BI is about understanding behavioral and giving the right kind of answers or right kind of policy based on the data that we've collected.
I guess so. Yeah. For instance, that question just now that happened was that somebody asked about having an open door policy and things like
Mm.
that. Maybe look at some behavioral interventions at work and then just multiply from there.
Mm. Yep. For the time being, there's no further questions from our
No,
viewers.
no questions. Either everybody understands everything or everybody doesn't understand anything.
Yeah, hopefully they understand. But I guess maybe you can sum up your webinars, these three framework, the I framework. What do you think is most important? What is your, if you are to tell everyone that listens, what is prime, what is your what do you really, look forward after this webinar?
Um, okay, so maybe I'm not sure which slide I can anchor it to, but maybe this one since we're talking about a framework. So today's session was not really about understanding all the behaviors. We have already done webinars on that, and also there's a lot of body of knowledge on that. But it's more about how you implement it, and that's where a lot of people struggle. Okay, I quite like. Okay, I understand. Yeah, it's like that. Right? You have, but how do I actually do it? Right. So this one sort of lays out a framework for you to think about it, how you're going to implement it. MPC is spearheading this initiative. It's also very new, very early actually. It is only a few months. Of course, the pandemic delayed a lot of things, right? So as time goes on, what MPC is doing is that they're expanding the body of knowledge within Malaysia. So there are many professors or many academicians and many experts that they're trying to encourage to look at different aspects and look at different case studies. There's some case studies they're doing in I mentioned in Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health, and there are many that are being run in most of the ministries. So what MPC would like to do is that um, when government departments or government ministries develop policies, right, they take into account behaviors. Right? So those behaviors become a bit more citizen centric. And because they become a bit more citizen centric, they become better policies, better regulations. And then what does that lead to? It leads to a better economy, maybe a better society, better productive, right? So this is actually a good thing that MPC as well as the government is doing, trying to be a bit more centric, user centric or consumer centric or citizen centric. But how? So as a start, let's look at the behaviors and improve on that. Otherwise, you have a lot of regulations and procedures and SOPs and all that. But the other thing that MPC is also concerned about is first they say, okay, you must fine tune your regulations so that it becomes good regulation. Second, you start looking at are there too many unnecessary regulations, especially now with technology, right? Some of these regulations have quite outdated, so you may need to look at how you remove unnecessary regulatory burden on people. Now we look at going a bit MPC looking at going a bit deeper and how we can then look at behavioral insights and tweak those policies, not just for MPC but on behalf of the rest of government as well as companies. Of course, MPC is also working with corporations, try to get those corporations to also be uh, public centric, you know, and look at people behavior so that when they look at people behaviors and not from just the company's point of view, that maybe then the products or services that they're doing are more well accepted, and hence it becomes more competitive, and so those companies succeed. When those companies succeed, it's good for the economy. So I think overall the goal is very good, right? So I encourage all of you to try to understand the behaviors and try to support this initiative.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Eddie Razak, for in my opinion, a very insightful session from the first to the third. And for the viewers, you can still check all the videos or the webinars in Behavior Insight Malaysia Facebook page. I'm not sure whether this will be in YouTube, but for the time being, you can check on Behavior Insight Malaysia Facebook page. So I would like again to thank Mr. Eddie Razak for his wonderful webinar, for his wonderful talk, to MPC for organizing, and to all the viewers for listening. And there are a lot of questions on certificate. Today you can fill in the certificate. It's in the chat area where you need to fill in the the form. There's a form that you need to fill in and the evaluation form. And after that, you will receive your certificate. So thank you everyone for attending, for listening, for participating. And again, thank you for Mr. Eddie Razak for his wonderful information and to MPC. So I guess that's it from us. Uh, Till we meet again in the future, do check the Behavior Inside Malaysia page and see you guys inshallah in the future. Assalamualaikum and bye.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you, MPC. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.